talks or presentations that have been given in this church. The first is by the Yes campaign, and because I have to minister to no campaigners too, the second will be done by the No campaign. But I'm delighted to see Dennis Canavan here. He's our first speaker. He is going to be giving his view on the Yes campaign and why it would be good for our community. And it's good to see so many of you. It's like an afternoon communion congregation, just a nice number. I have to tell you something, Dennis, and this is quite important. When I was speaking to the Better Together office, they assured me that if we all voted no, that they would double their offerings to the Kirk. I just hope you can match that tonight. So without much further ado, I'd like to welcome Dennis to speak at this meeting to inform the public of Nairn. So you're very welcome.
Thank you for your kind words of introduction, and thank you all for coming along here to this meeting this evening. It's good to be back in Nairn. The last time I was here, I think I was a guest of the Nairn Book Festival, and I remember walking along the beach. I was living at that time in a relatively posh hotel, which the Book Festival had provided for me. And I was walking along in the morning along the beach, and I came across this notice describing Nairn as the Brighton of the North. What an insult! What an insult! I mean, I've been to Brighton many a time. I used to go to Brighton to Labour Party conferences. I mean, you've seen Brighton Beach. Hasn't got a grain of sand on it at all. It's just a pebble beach. It's not a patch on this wonderful beach that you have here in Nairn. I would describe it as maybe the Canavan of the North, rather than the Brighton of the North. Sometimes in Scotland we do undersell ourselves and the beautiful environment in which we live. Anyway, I've been asked to speak about the Yes Scotland campaign, and I must confess at the outset that I am a convert to the cause of independence. I know that there are some of you who may be undecided, and there may be some of you who are inclined to vote no, and there may be some of you too who have been campaigning for independence all of your political lives. Well, Fergus is coming along later on. I think that Fergus and his family have been campaigning for Scottish independence all of their political lives. I cannot claim that particular credit, but I would like to tell you something of my political journey. I was virtually born and brought up in the Labour Party. My grandfather, in fact, was one of the founding members of the first branch of the Labour Party in the county of Fife. My grandfather wasn't a Scot, born and bred. He was born in Ireland, and he came to Scotland at the age of 4. He was the youngest of 11 children, and I suppose they would be described nowadays as economic migrants that came to Scotland looking for work. And my granddad left school at the age of 10, and at that time the family by then were based in the mining community of Canavan in Fife. And they had an Act of Parliament at that time which said no women are allowed to work underground in the coal industry, and no children either. A child at that time, for the purposes of that Act of Parliament, was defined as somebody the age of 12 or under. So my grandfather had to wait 2 years after leaving school and work in the retail industry before starting down the pit at the age of 12. And he spent virtually his whole working life, mainly in the labour and trade union movement, and also in local government, trying to improve the lot of his fellow workers and also trying to improve the lot of his fellow citizens in the community in which he lived. And what was it that these socialist pioneers were campaigning for? They were campaigning for basic things like the right to work, the right to earn a decent living for themselves and their families, the right to have a roof over their heads, the right for education for their children, and the right to a free national health service. These were the sort of basic human rights that they were campaigning for. And what was it that drove them? It was a hunger, sometimes a real pang in the belly hunger, but always a hunger for social justice. And I maintain that that hunger for social justice is something which is the main driving force behind the campaign for Scottish independence today. Now, here we are in a situation where, well, a lot of people in this area and other parts of Scotland are suffering. Look at the number of people who are dependent upon food banks for a start. So there still is that real hunger in many bellies. And of course we have a government at Westminster which to my mind isn't doing enough to solve the particular problems which are faced by many people in society today. And I used to think, like how my granddad used to think, that the best way to solve this situation was to get the return of a Labour government. In fact, I remember a general election many years ago that I fought. I think it was in 1979, a general election, when the question was put to the people of this country: what kind of society do you want to build? Do you want a selfish, ruthless rat race where only the strongest survive and the weakest go to the wall? Or do you want a caring, sharing society where people look after their neighbour and where most help goes to the people who are most in need? Well, that was a question that was put at that time, and by and large, at that 1979 general election, my recollection is that by and large the people of Scotland voted for the caring, sharing society, but we were outnumbered by the people of the United Kingdom as a whole, and the result was that we all got a Prime Minister who boasted in the kirk that there is no such thing as society. Well, here we are again today. Scotland is being ruled by a government we did not elect. And we have a Tory-led coalition at Westminster which is rewarding the rich with massive tax handouts and attacking the poor with massive cuts in their benefits, including this iniquitous bedroom tax and a cap on benefits which is causing hardship to many families. So it's understandable that people are crying out for change. What does Westminster offer by way of change? Well, as I said, we've got this Tory-led coalition government at Westminster. They seem intent on pursuing their existing policies, so there's no hope of change in that situation. What about the opposition at Westminster? Well, I sometimes, turn on the telly and watch and listen to what is said from the opposition benches which I used to occupy at Westminster all these years ago. And I see the leader of the opposition is up in Scotland today with his shadow cabinet, but in all honesty, I see very little commitment there. I just see the official opposition in Westminster offering another brand of austerity. And I do not honestly think that changing the occupancy of number 10 Downing Street is going to bring about the change, the fundamental change, the radical change which the most of the people of Scotland want. So I have lost faith. I have no faith at all now in the constitutional status quo. I'm not saying that independence is a panacea which is going to lead to a land flowing with milk and honey, but I do think that independence does offer the people of Scotland a huge opportunity, the opportunity of a lifetime. It offers us the opportunity for the type of change which I believe that the majority of the people of Scotland want. Now, I said earlier that I'm a convert to the cause of Scottish independence. And my conversion is not based on emotion or some great Damascus-type experience or anything like that. My conversion is based mainly on my parliamentary experience. That I spent, some people might say I misspent 26 years as a Member of Parliament at Westminster, followed by 8 years in the Scottish Parliament, and I've been retired now for 7 years I've been retired, and I haven't just been vegetating in retirement. I've found that retirement gives me time to think, time to reflect, time to look at things a bit more objectively, because when you're involved in a cocoon type of existence like Westminster, it's sometimes very difficult to stand outside that cocoon and look at things objectively. And I've had that opportunity, and there may be some of you here in this audience today who find that sometimes the case in retirement, that it does give you time to reflect on the past and to think about the future, not just for yourselves, but for your children and your grandchildren. And I have come to the conclusion after a great deal of reflection that Westminster is completely out of touch with the people of Scotland. The Scottish Parliament, on the other hand, is not perfect. It's made up of human beings, and human beings make mistakes. But by and large, I think that the Scottish Parliament responds far more readily and far more positively to the needs and the wishes and the aspirations of the people of Scotland. Now, let me give just a few examples to justify that. Land reform. This is a fairly rural part of Scotland, where I think that land reform is very relevant to many rural communities. Now, I remember shortly after the Scottish Parliament was introduced, they abolished the feudal system, which had been prevalent in Scotland since medieval times. Westminster never got round to abolishing the iniquities of the feudal system. And yet, within the first term of the Scottish Parliament, land reform was introduced to abolish the feudal system, and also, in certain circumstances, to give communities the right to buy land rather than land being simply the property of the landed gentry. And for those of you like myself who don't own much land at all, or maybe none at all, the same Act of Parliament in 2003 the Land Reform Scotland Act, which I believe is one of the most radical pieces of legislation passed by the Scottish Parliament, it gave everybody the right of access to enjoy land through recreational purposes, through walking, through sport, whatever. And that is very, very important. As I said, land should not simply be seen as the property of the landed gentry, that everybody should have the right of access to land, that mountains or hills or glens, part of a natural scenic beauty in Scotland, that is simply not the property of a minority of people. It should be there as something which all of us, as citizens of Scotland, and indeed from further afield, have the right to access and enjoy in a responsible manner. So land reform is just one example of what the Scottish Parliament has achieved. I can think too of higher education. I felt ashamed as a member of the Westminster Parliament when a Labour government, we waited 18 years for a Labour government to come in, and one of the first things that Labour government did under Mr Blair's premiership was to introduce tuition fees for students at university. A lot of people think it was Margaret Thatcher that introduced, or John Major that introduced tuition fees. It wasn't. It was a Labour government, and that was part of my undoing why they kind of disowned me, because I couldn't stomach voting for legislation like that. I told you about my grandfather. He and his colleagues had campaigned away back in the 1920s to enable working class children to stay on at school beyond the statutory school leaving age, and in some cases to get grants to go on to college or university. And virtually every local authority in Scotland eventually followed that example, and it was under Harold Wilson's government that the student grant system was nationalised, and the level of student grants was probably the most generous in the world. Of course, Mr Blair didn't understand all this because he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, and I mean, his mum and dad didn't have to scrimp and save to send a child to Fergus College or to university. But there were other people in that cabinet, some of them sitting in the House of Lords now, like Lord Reid. I remember him, a student revolutionary at Stirling University in the 1970s when I was a young Labour MP, and he was leading the charge against Harold Wilson because he wasn't introducing the student grant by at least the rate of inflation. The rate of inflation at that time was about 25%. I mean, the demands were utterly ludicrous. And yet the same John Reid, when he becomes a Labour MP some years later, one of the first things he does as a member of a Labour cabinet is to vote for the complete abolition of student grants, and also a double whammy at the same time to introduce tuition fees. Well, I thought that was disgraceful, and I was very pleased when I became a member of the Scottish Parliament, which in the first instance abolished upfront tuition fees, and then when a new Scottish government came in, there was a complete abolition of tuition fees. And I think that when you look at and compare how students south of the border are suffering, some of them are £9,000 a year in tuition fees. That's for 4 years orders course, that would be £36,000, a millstone of debt round young people's necks at a time when they're just starting off in a new career and possibly thinking about getting married and having a family and all that. I mean, imagine that kind of millstone of debt around the necks of students. Well, thanks to the Scottish Parliament, we do not have that. I can think too of care of the elderly. The Sutherland report recommended in the late 1990s that the personal element of care and the nursing element of care should be free of charge for for senior citizens who require that kind of care. That was never fully implemented south of the border, but thanks to the Scottish Parliament, senior citizens do enjoy that element of free care. I can think of prescriptions charges as well, and the National Health Service in general, because what is happening to the National Health Service south of the border is a gradual programme of privatisation, so that soon, unless that trend is stopped, the National Health Service south of the border will be unrecognisable. And of course, in Scotland, not only do we have a publicly owned National Health Service, but we also have a National Health Service which is free at the point of need, with no prescription charges, again thanks to the Scottish Government. And yet I hear some of the Labour opposition, even some of them in Scotland, coming out and saying that this is a terrible accusation, that this is just some plot by that dreadful man Alex Salmon, a plot just to try and bribe the people of Scotland with some sweeties to get them to vote no, or rather in Alex Salmon's case, to get them to vote yes in the Scottish referendum. Well, I ask you, is free education a sweetie? Is a free National Health Service just a sweetie? I mean, some of these Labour pioneers like Keir Hardie and Nye Bevan must be burling in their graves when they hear language like that from so-called socialists, because a free National Health Service and a free education were two of the pillars on which the Labour Party was founded. So I believe that the Scottish Parliament has, in its 15 years of existence, it has delivered higher standards of social justice in many areas compared with the decisions that have been taken and continue to be taken at Westminster. And the Scottish Parliament has done this despite the fact that its powers are very limited, because most of the big decisions, especially the big economic decisions, are still taken by the Westminster Parliament rather than the Scottish Parliament. And I say to myself that if we had a fully independent Scottish Parliament, then we'd be able to deliver so much more for the people of Scotland. And let me give me a few examples. If the Scottish Parliament had powers over defence and foreign affairs, then we'd be able to get rid of weapons of mass destruction like Trident, and also stop our involvement in illegal warfare. If we had in the Scottish Parliament the powers to regulate the financial institutions, then we'd be able to stop the culture of bankers lining their pockets with big fat bonuses while bringing the country almost to the brink of economic disaster. And if the Scottish Parliament had power over tax and national insurance, we'd be able to introduce a fair, progressive system of taxation, whereby the rich pay more tax, the poor pay less tax, and the very poor shouldn't be paying any tax at all. And we'd also be able to introduce a fairer system of benefits, including the abolition of the iniquitous bedroom tax, to which I earlier referred. So, I do not see independence as an end in itself. I see it as a means of building a better Scotland, a more prosperous Scotland, but above all, a fairer Scotland. And why should we just stop with Scotland? There's an old Scots saying, we're all Jock Tamson's bairns. Some people might translate that as saying we're all God's children. Well, whether you believe in God or otherwise, another translation might be, we're all citizens of the world. We're all members of the human race. And we have a duty to our neighbour, whether our neighbour is Scottish or whether our neighbour is from any other country in the world. And you know, I cannot stomach at times the anti-internationalist, almost racist agenda which I see emanating from some Westminster politicians. Their agenda is increasingly anti-European, increasingly xenophobic. We've got a situation where we've got a UKIP tail wagging the Tory dog, and I want to see a Scotland which is based on a true ethical foreign policy and an immigration policy which is based on the equality and human rights of all our people, whatever their race, whatever their ethnic origin, whatever their nationality. Before I finish and hand over to Fergus, I'd just like to say a wee word about Yes Scotland, because I chair the advisory board of the Yes Scotland campaign. We are a broad, inclusive campaign consisting of people of various political parties. It's not true that we're simply a front for the SNP. We've got people who are Greens, people who are Socialists. We've got people who are Labour Party members, people who are Labour voters, people who are Lib Dem voters. I don't know of any Tory voters who are part of our campaign, but they're welcome to join us if they want, because we want to make it a broad, inclusive campaign. Sometimes it's difficult getting the message across to some people, because there is an element of tribalism amongst some people in Scotland. You know, I mean, I came across a lady the other day there, one of my most fervent supporters. She supported me through thick and thin when I was a Labour MP and afterwards when I was an independent MSP. But when I was asking her to vote yes in the referendum, she initially said, no, that's a step too far, son, that's a step too far. No, she said, you can't seriously expect me to vote for Alexander, to vote for the SNP. My father would kill me. I said to her, well, look, Janet, for a start, your father's been dead for 20 years now. Thanks to you, you're safe enough there. I said, but I'm not asking you to vote for Alex Salmon. I'm not asking you to vote in this referendum for the SNP. I'm not asking you to vote for any political party. What I'm asking you to vote for in this referendum is I'm asking you to vote for a better future for you and your parents and your grandparents and for all the people of Scotland. That is what this referendum is about. It's about giving the people of Scotland the opportunity to choose their own government. I'm often asked too, can we win? Well, this time last year, I remember there were a lot of pessimists, and of course the other lot from the no side, they were saying, oh, we're well ahead in the opinion polls. There was an element of big-headedness, arrogance, complacency about them, you know, and this, what the yes side have got no chance, etc., etc. And I remember saying at the SNP conference in Inverness at the time that, you know, the posters and pundits mostly were saying, you've got a mountain to climb, and my thought was, oh, I like climbing mountains, and I really do think that we're a bit up the hill from where we were this time last year. We're closing the gap. I'm not being complacent. We've still got a huge amount of work to do. But as I say, we're closing the gap and the momentum is on our side. And I think that we've got something which the other lot do not have. You might think that they're getting the better of the campaign in terms of their coverage in the media, particularly the print media, and very often accusations of bias on the part of the BBC and STV and what have you. But you know something? This campaign is not simply going to be won in TV studios or radio studios or the column inches of certain newspapers. This campaign is going to be fought and won at grassroots level amongst the people of Scotland. And that's why I am here tonight, because I think that we have got the potential in our campaign to build a successful community-based campaign, because we've got something which the other lot don't have, and that is an army of volunteers who are going to work throughout the whole of Scotland. And when I come to communities such as this, and I've travelled the length and breadth of Scotland over the past year, I see virtually nothing going on at community grassroots level on the part of the No campaign. You know why? Not only do they not have a vision, they don't have any foot soldiers to work and to spread the message about that vision. And we have the potential to build the most successful and the most comprehensive grassroots community campaign that Scotland has ever seen. And we are determined to take our message out to every town, every village, every city, every hamlet, every school, every university, every workplace, every shopping centre in Scotland. And what is our message? It's quite a simple message, and it is this: that it's only by voting yes in this referendum that the people of Scotland are going to be empowered to build a better Scotland, a fairer Scotland, a more prosperous Scotland, and a Scotland which will work within the international community to help to build a fairer and better world. That is our simple message, and when we get our message across to the people of Scotland, I am sure that we shall win a famous and historic victory. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your words. When I closed my eyes, you sounded like an Old Testament prophet. I know that you spent this morning at the celebration of life of Margaret MacDonald, someone who's another stalwart and independent, and I know that people appreciate your independence and your integrity and your commitment, even though they might not necessarily agree with you. And I hope you'll be able to take some questions later, some pointed questions from the audience, just to see if you're as agile as I hope in promoting your cause. So thank you very much again. I'd now like to ask a New Testament prophet to come and speak. So Fergus needs very little introduction. He's well known to us. He's one of our MSPs. So I'd like him to come and speak about the Yes campaign. So thank you, Fergus.
Thank you, Stephen. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. No one has ever compared me to a prophet before. Whether the Testament is old or new, but it's a real pleasure to be here. And as Stephen, you said earlier today, in our adopted city of Edinburgh, there was a quite magnificent service to celebrate the memory of Margot MacDonald. I wasn't able to attend, but I heard some of it on the radio, and there were magnificent contributions from Alex Neil, from Elaine C. Smith, and from her husband Jim Sillars, and it was quite a stirring, passionate and moving service to remember a truly remarkable lady whose gifts to communicate to people effectively and speak for Scotland were unparalleled. There's not many people in politics who are known by their first name. Margot was one. Winnie is another one, I think I may say too. And I think it's a tragedy that having campaigned for independence all of her life in her way, that she's not able to cast her vote on the 18th of September. But Margot, Dennis and myself were the class of 1999 when our Scottish Parliament was reconvened. And whilst Margaret, my wife, and Dennis had served together in Westminster, as Dennis had said, an experience which both of them found extremely frustrating, with a heart-rending and futile struggle, quite frankly. Nonetheless, I wasn't able to get to know Dennis until I was elected to the Scottish Parliament, first session of the Scottish Parliament in 1999. Of course, Dennis had been a loyal servant to the Labour Party for many, many years, elected as an MP. But lo and behold, sometime about a year before, I think it was Dennis, he was adjudged not to be fit to be a candidate for the Labour Party for the Scottish Parliament, having been fit to be an MP for the Labour Party since 1974, was it, Dennis? Is that right? So having been suitable to serve as a parliamentary representative for a party for 2.5 decades, he was suddenly persona non grata and not deemed eligible in sufficient quality to be accepted as a Labour Party candidate. I have to say, without being too personal, some of the people that they did put in the list, I'll leave it there. But you see, Dennis had the last laugh because he stood as an independent. He said, well, if you won't have me, I'm going to stand as an independent, because Dennis had campaigned for the Scottish Parliament with as much passion as anybody else. In fact, an awful lot more passion than some I could name. And when he did, he was elected by people of Falkirk with the biggest majority in the whole of Scotland. However, then I didn't get to know Dennis, but I did get to know Dennis in 2001, and I wanted just to retail this experience to you because I think it's relevant in a number of ways. And the issue upon which we worked together particularly closely was that of the Scottish Transport Group. And let me just explain that. The Scottish Transport Group was the result of the privatisation of transport in the 80s by Mrs Thatcher of the transport services, and it affected a great many workers, mostly on low pay, drivers, cleaners, clerks, those who worked in Inverness for Highland omnibuses, for various bus companies, for Caledonian McBrain as well, and Dennis represented a great many of the workforce in the Central Belt. And guess what happened? At the privatisation, it was part of the deal of the privatisation that the occupational pension fund to which these workers were entitled was retained. They weren't entitled to their own pension that they had contributed to all of their working lives. And this, of course, was a campaign which no less a personage than Gordon Brown, when in opposition, had said was a complete disgrace and must be rectified by the complete reinstatement of the whole of the pension fund to these workers. And we're not talking about enormous sums of money either. And therefore Dennis took up this case, and so did I. We had a debate in 2001, and I reread it the other day preparatory to this meeting and the meeting we're doing tomorrow in Inverness. And we persuaded the Scottish Parliament to exert pressure on the UK government to return the pension fund to those workers. However, they didn't return the whole money. The accumulated value of the fund was circa £250 million. They only returned 100 million. And then grudgingly during the debate, if you remember Dennis, they announced a further 18 million, which the accrued interest anyway would be added to this. But they retained the rest of it. And Gordon Brown, at this time, of course, was Chancellor. And therefore, he reneged on the promise which he made that he would deliver when he said in opposition, I will give you your pension back when I become the Prime Minister or the Chancellor of the Exchequer he was. So Dennis and I campaigned on that then. And I tell you this, and it's relevant, not just because it allowed me to get to know Dennis better and establish a respect for him, which has retained and strengthened over the years, but it's relevant for a number of other ways. Firstly, if there hadn't been a Scottish Parliament, there would have been no platform upon which to pursue this cause. And I think that it's unlikely that they would have been successful, or even to the partial extent it was. Secondly, in the debate that we held in the Scottish Parliament, and this is relevant too, I think, Dennis wasn't in the SNP. The debate was on the SNP time. We were in opposition, so we have an entitlement as opposition to hold a debate on any matter of our choosing. And I said to my colleagues in the SNP, look, rather than me make the leading speech, let Dennis do it, because he's led the campaign. Let's work across parties, not just the SNP. Let's work together on an issue which, quite frankly, transcended any party. So we did that in 2001, and we did that in the Scottish Parliament because we do work better across parties. And we did, as a result of that, I think, Dennis, achieve a result, not the result that we would have had we had independence, but a result because of the Scottish Parliament. So I wanted to start off by paying tribute to Dennis's leadership of that campaign. What is independence about? What is it not about? It is not about being against other people, whether they come from England or any other part of the world. We are, not just in the SNP, but as a country, absolutely determined to welcome people to Scotland. And we cannot say this often enough. And of course, it's not just rhetoric, it is fact, because the whole history of Scotland has been one where we have welcomed people from other communities and countries. People from Ireland, people from Italy, people during the horrific days prior to the Second World War came to seek refuge from the predations and the horrible actions of the Nazis in the 30s, came to live in Glasgow. And my mother was born in a school where there were many Jewish children who had no parents because they came from Germany and they came from Poland and they came from what is now the Czech Republic, and they became citizens of Scotland and they were welcome. And then, of course, we had a wave of people who came to Scotland from Asia, particularly from Pakistan. A great many of them were my clients when I had a legal practice in Glasgow, and we welcomed them. I spent some time, as did Dennis, climbing mountains too, and in doing so in the mountain rescue team, there were a great many people from England who were in that rescue team. In fact, many of them worked at Fast Lane, and I'll tell you this, they were great guys, absolutely great guys, and girls, I should say, want to be sexist about this. And nobody loved Scotland more than some of these guys who decided to make Scotland their home, and after the work was finished, to retire here. So it's important to make that clear, that so far as the SNP is concerned, everybody is welcome to Scotland. And one of the most chilling books I've ever read is relevant more now, I think, in the days of the horrific party called UKIP than it has been for a long time. And that is a book I read 40 years ago called L'Étranger by Albert Camus. And I have this message, that for an independent Scotland, nobody will be an outsider. And it's very important to state that clearly and strongly, and I take the opportunity to do that tonight. Of course, there are a great deal of scares about what independence would mean. Some of them are somewhat ludicrous. For example, it has been seriously said that after independence, this was by a senior Westminster politician, the Chinese would confiscate the pandas from Edinburgh Zoo. A gentleman whom I don't know, called Andy Burnham, who I believe was a Labour cabinet minister, opined that after independence, the Scots would have to drive on the right-hand side of the road. I don't know when this transition is going to take place, incidentally, overnight, but anyway, he said that. And thirdly, there's no shortage of other ones actually, but thirdly, after independence, we wouldn't be allowed to take part in the Eurovision Song Contest. Is that a threat or a promise? But there are different views. You know, there's a huge range of views, and I wanted to tackle some of the more serious issues tonight, but Some of the views that I hear are, I'm not voting yes because I don't like Alex Salmond or Nicola Sturgeon. This is completely, I would submit, with respect, the wrong way to approach this. Whether we vote yes or no, let's vote for the right reasons, or sensible, serious reasons, not for personal reasons, personalities. Let there be no personal rancour in this debate. I find it part of the debate, actually, that's a bit unpleasant and off-putting, the amount of personal rancour and abuse. When I was in a similar debate in Sandwich, near Lerwick, about 6 weeks ago, a gentleman, after I'd made my contribution, had a long question. It's more of a point really, and it was the effect that he thought Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon were unresponsive, strident, unreasonable, and he went on and on and on and on. And I said various things in response. I said, well, actually, look, I can absolutely assure you, I've spent all my life, my adult life, working with Alex Salmond, and I've spent since the early 90s working with Nicola Sturgeon, and they are absolutely devoted to the people of Scotland, and they spend their whole working lives doing their best for the people of Scotland. Maybe sometimes they come across in a way that you don't like, but I said, at root, beneath it all, they are both softies. And I didn't think any more about it, but of course you forget that in these days, this is being recorded, of course, you forget that people can tweet things. And I was sitting in the Holyrood chamber a few weeks later, and Nicola Sturgeon was sitting right in front of me, and she turned round and she spoke to me somewhat icily. She said, Fergus, I hear you think that I'm a softie. So you have to watch what you say, but let's not personalise this. It's too important. We have an opportunity to do something that there's a lot of people who are not around, Margot and many others would like to do, and that's put our cross on that ballot paper on the 18th of September. Those of us who have been in the SNP, and many of us who haven't been in the SNP, have waited all our lives for this, quite frankly. And in fact, it is the truth that those in the SNP are united by the desire to see Scotland independent. None of us, frankly, expected to be in a job doing this. In fact, most of the people who are ministers in the Scottish Government did various jobs with the full expectation that we would never be in politics. The reason we're in the SNP is to get independence for Scotland. So the decision on the 18th of September is by far the most important one we will ever take. Therefore we should take it on serious reasons. So I wanted to address, and I'm addressing perhaps some of those in the audience that are not yet decided, and reaching out perhaps to you, ladies and gentlemen, who haven't made your mind up, because we're in the business of persuasion here. That's our task. Excuse me to all the people that are just going to vote yes anyway. I can see quite a few of you actually. That's fine. But let me just address some of the main scare stories. And they really are scare stories. I do honestly think that they are designed to scare people. First of all, the pound. This is probably the most significant issue in many ways. Now, it's said that we wouldn't be allowed to keep the pound, despite the fact that the pound is as much ours as anybody else's. The Bank of England is, in fact, about as English as Scotland Yard is Scottish, and is a British asset nationalised in 1946, to which we have a pro rata claim. But the clinching argument about the pound is a very, very simple one. And it is this, that the rest of the UK do business in Scotland on an enormous scale. They provide goods and services. Businesses in England, Wales, Northern Ireland do an enormous amount of business in Scotland, and that is good. And of course that will continue. There's no barriers, there's no barriers at the border, no trade barriers. There can't be anyway in the EU. It's illegal, frankly. Now, were there to be a different currency in Scotland, then of course there would be currency exchange costs imposed on those businesses. The estimated cost of that in cumulative would be several £100 million. Now, why on earth, what possible reason would there be for a UK government, our UK government, to impose gratuitous extra costs on these businesses? What would the purpose be? Many of their arguments are that independence would involve extra costs, arguments which we dispute. But here we have an example of the political stance which I think it is they take. They say that we wouldn't be entitled to use the pound sterling, we wouldn't have a currency zone as we proposed for 10 years. But they accept the fact that there would be additional transaction costs of a very substantial order which would be imposed to business. Why would anybody want to do that? The total exports to Scotland per annum for the rest of the UK are, believe it or not, 50,000 million pounds a year. 50 billion a year. That's actually more exports. Scotland is a market for the rest of the UK, more important and greater in volume and amount than the combination of exports from the rest of the UK to the following countries: Russia, Japan, China, India, Brazil and South Africa. In other words, we are a more important market than all of these countries put together. What on earth would be the point in the unilateral imposition of currency costs on these businesses? It was Professor Anton Muscatelli, the principal of Glasgow University, and not an SNP man, I don't think, not aligned. He came out with an article in the Financial Times, I think it was, several weeks ago, where he argued very strongly that the approach that the Nobel laureate economists that have advised Alex Salmond and John Swinney on this matter are correct. And the approach of the UK would be, quotes, economic vandalism. What would the point in that be? There would be no point to it. Of course, we will know that on the end of March, The Guardian ran a story, and the story was that an unnamed UK government minister, inverted commas, at the heart of the Better Together campaign, said, of course there will be a currency union. After the politicking is over and the negotiations begin, there will be a currency union. And that, according to The Guardian, was from a minister at the heart of the No campaign. So, when Alex Salmond argued that the current position which the Better Together campaign have adopted in the currency is a bluff, that is exactly what it is. But the reason it's a bluff is that it's designed to make us afraid. If you look at some of the language used actually by the Better Together campaign, I actually find it, I've been struggling for the right word, certainly unsavoury, and perhaps worse than that. I'm thinking about George Robertson's claim that an independent Scotland, he made the speech in the USA, not even here. He said that an independent Scotland would, so far as defence terms, be, quotes, allied with the forces of darkness. Does anyone really believe that, apart from Lord George Robertson? Where did he get that idea from? Which countries are we planning to invade? Do you know? I mean, this really is OTT. Another comment that I noted that was reported, and I checked the quote, don't want to misquote anybody here, but our Secretary of State for Scotland, Alistair Carmichael, came to the Scottish Parliament and he gave evidence about the EU membership issue. And he said, and I quote, he said, the case for Scotland being an independent member of the EU in her own right is, and I quote, a corpse riddled with bullets. Now, this language is not just over the top, but I think it is really quite repellent. And I have to say this, because I find it unsavoury. I don't like the debate being couched in this way, and I think I speak for a lot of people who find it is a turn-off, quite frankly. But it is over the top. Of course we will continue to be a member of Europe. We have been in the EU in its various forms since the 70s. They've never kicked anybody out. Greenland had to have a referendum to get out. A whole raft of experts, judges, former heads of the European Commission have said that Scotland, of course, would be in. And the real issue, frankly, is the negotiation of the best terms for Scotland, not whether we would be a member. And I think the more sensible members of the Better Together campaign have actually admitted that. And of course, when you look at the terms, for example, in farming, Ireland has got an immeasurably better deal under the new round of farming subsidies than the UK. Scotland has got about the worst possible deal in the UK. Richard Lockhead calculates we would be £800 million better off in these subsidy payments by 2020, and he spends his whole life working to stand up for Scottish farmers, and therefore I would put a lot of weight on his judgment on this matter. So, what is the conclusion that we would draw? I would draw this conclusion, that where those campaigners and Better Together are using these scare stories, their intention and their objective is not to inform, to provide you with a truthful, factual account of the arguments and the facts underlying them, but rather it is pure, designed to make people afraid. I read my 5-year-old daughter stories when I see her, which is not every night, but I read her stories. And quite often she says, she's only 5, she says, don't like stories with baddies in them, Daddy. They're scary. Now think about it. Are adults that much different from children? We can all be easily made to be afraid. And at the end of the day, if you agree with my proposition that the whole objective is to make people afraid, then I think you must start to question the motives of those who are putting forward these arguments. Now, of course, another round of arguments are along the lines that we will not be able to afford independence. This is something that we hear every day, and there are a whole number of strands of this argument. I'm privileged because I spend really all of my time, almost all of my time at any rate, as Minister for Energy, Enterprise and Tourism. I've got sort of 3 jobs, one salary I should emphasise, just to be a shoe, but 3 jobs. And I go around the country all the time. In fact, I think, I don't know if I should say this because it's being recorded, but I've got, I think, the second worst voting record after the First Minister, because I'm just doing the boots all the time. And the reason is, I need to find out what's happening. So I'm going to meet companies and businesses all over Scotland, all the time. In the last few months, I've been to Stornoway, Lerwick, Kirkwall, Caithness, Dumfries, every city in Scotland, and I meet with Chambers, FSB, IOD all the time, and that's my job, and I love it, so I don't want anyone else to get it, so I keep it in the box, you know. But what I see, the point is this, what I see from my privileged position, perhaps more privileged than anybody else, I see a country where we have enormous success in a huge range of areas, across a whole number of sectors. We have outstanding businesses performing brilliantly, leading the world in a whole range of areas: finance, renewable energy, oil and gas, tourism, digital and media, textiles, engineering, defence. A whole range of topics. We earn £13 billion from food and drink, £15 billion from manufacturing, £17 billion from oil and gas. There are 11,700 people that now work in renewable energy in Scotland. We have enormous success. But you know what is the most important thing of all? The most important thing is the people that are leading these businesses. That's the most important thing of all. And that's the most valuable thing of all. It's the human capital that will make this country, post-independence, one of the most successful countries in this planet. So far as the budgetary figures are concerned, over the last 33 years, in every single year, we have, per head, paid more tax than the average UK citizen. We have contributed more per head than the UK citizen. In fact, even if you disregard oil and gas altogether, we're at 99% of GDP. Now, all of us know from our own lives and observations that there are many rich people and rich businesses in the world that manage to squander their legacy. Being rich in itself is not enough. It's very easy for a rich man to blow it all, to throw it all away, to lose a fortune. And it's easy for a business to do the same thing. So I put it to you that the really important issue here is what we do with our wealth. It's not how wealthy we are in the sense of a balance sheet position. It's what we do with our wealth. Now, I wanted to turn towards reasons for voting for independence. And first of all, if we have independence, and only if we have independence, will we be able to decide whether we as a country send our young men to war. We did not have that power in the 90s, in the first Iraq conflict, or the second, nor in the Afghanistan conflict. What would Scotland have done had we had that power? In future, are we going to be taken into, as we very nearly were, as the Cabinet wanted to, we just couldn't get it through the Commons, a war in Syria. It's easy to start a war, isn't it? Very difficult to finish it. But without independence, we have no say. Actually, I think if we were possessed of those powers, it would act as a brake on some of the imperialist ambitions of people like Tony Blair that seem to end up in positions of power under the UK, and through their abilities and undoubted intellectual and persuasive skills managed to hoodwink the House of Commons into taking us into a war on a completely false premise. If Scotland is independent, there will be a new dynamic in that debate, I think. And that in itself is a good thing, irrespective of the benefits to Scotland. Secondly, an independent Scotland, and only with an independent Scotland, will we, as Dennis has argued, be able to do a whole raft of things that I hope all of us would agree were correct. Get rid of the bedroom tax. Deal with payday loans, incidentally, one of the real scourges of society today, an absolute scandal which has not been regulated properly in the UK, although it has been regulated in just about every civilised country in the world. And this is within my area, so I can see very clearly that young people are getting into horrendous debt because you can get 100 quid repeatedly over a phone app at the bookies, and thereby get yourself into problems that will scar you for 20 years, removing your credit rating for young people their lifetime. It's a complete scandal, but we don't have the power to tackle it at the moment. We will have, of course, the power over taxation at a high level. Taxation over oil and gas, for example. I spend a lot of time in oil and gas and renewables. The recent argument by the Better Together campaign has been that Scotland wouldn't be able to run the oil and gas industry because we haven't got broad shoulders. That was it. We haven't got broad shoulders, so we can't run the industry. Well, excuse me, how come Norway, with the population, the precise same number as Scotland, with its narrow shoulders, managed to amass an oil fund which will be a legacy for its nation for this century and forever, frankly, of £500,000 million. Norway have extracted oil from the same waters contiguous to ours over the same period, for the same duration. They have extracted more of it because they took charge. They didn't let the oil companies do what they wanted to do. They took charge. They said you must extract all the oil, even if it is not most economically suitable to you. Read the story by John Howell in the Press and Journal, which is either in or will be in shortly, and read the story about the Troll field and how the Norwegians stewarded that field. They said to the oil companies, you must get all the oil out, even though it's going to cost you a lot more, because we want the tax revenue for our oil fund. And do you know, £500,000 million, I mean, it's too large to contemplate. I don't think many people in Nairn are familiar with the £1 billion, £1 billion note. You don't see it from the high street, do we? We can't contemplate how enormous it is. But they built it up since 1996. They didn't start putting money into their oil fund until 6 years after it was created. And in 18 years, they built up this tremendous asset, which they are now using for the benefit of their people. If you go to Oslo, as I did in January, you'll see that what they've done for the city of Oslo is build out a number of tunnels so the cars don't go into the city centre. They've got the most tremendous transport system that any city could have, and people can walk around safely in the centre of Oslo because they've invested in all this, because they can, because they've stewarded the money. Now, that power of taxation is needed for us to deal with this. And as Sir Ian Wood opined recently, the UK, frankly, has an appalling record, both on tax and regulation. So, in relation to tax, we need the powers of independence. In relation to spending as well, of course, we need the powers that independence would bring. We only have partial powers at the moment. I would also put it to you that there's a reason for independence, and I think Dennis covered this very well, so I won't dwell on it, but we have had a bit of home rule. We have a Scottish Parliament. We've got some powers. I think that although we've made some mistakes, and no government will ever, goodness knows, be perfect, I think we've done a reasonable job for the people of Scotland. In fact, I often hear on the radio people in England saying, I wish we had the prescription charges, I wish we had the free transport, I wish we had the council tax fees, and above all, I wish our children didn't have to pay, as Dennis said, £9,000 a year to have an education. I hear that a lot down south. None of these things would have happened had there not been a Scottish Parliament. So, the argument putting it at its simplest is, if we are able, by and large, because we'll never please everybody, nor should you actually try, in my humble opinion, but we have managed to do good for the people of Scotland. The people who need most help have, so far as we've been able to do, got a bit of help with the powers that we've got. But just think what we could do if we had more powers. Ladies and gentlemen, I've probably, as per usual, spoken for far longer than I should, so probably all wanting a wee bit of a break and a chance to have your say, because often these meetings really come to life when I shut up and you start to speak. So I'm just going to do that in a minute. I just want to finish by saying that on the 18th of September, we have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to reclaim our country, our destiny, and the right to govern our own affairs. I hope we take it.
Thank you very much, Fergus, for speaking. I'd just like to say something for the panel to think about. I'm the chaplain at the Academy, and I'm just looking around the audience here. Who under 30 is represented here? I know in the Academy there's been a vote about this matter, but I'm just wondering how younger people are being engaged. And I've also noticed at the Better Together campaign rally, again, an absence of younger people. What is it about our political system, even if we're trying to change it, that we seem to be indifferent for the younger people in our community? Just as a comment to reflect upon. Now I'm going to ask another extremely well-known person in Nairnshire, Liz MacDonald, one of our councillors, to come and have a few words, and then we'll be having questions to the panel.
Thank you, Stephen. And I'm not going to take very long because I think it's really important we get on to the question and answer session. I'm delighted that we've gone back to this old style of politics. I think it's terrific, like Dennis was saying and Fergus, we're going round all the public halls and schools and to having meetings to get our message across to people. I think that's the only way we're going to be able to win this argument, because it's with face-to-face contact and listening to your concerns and responding to them is the only way that we're going to be able to deal with it and find a successful way through. And it's not just the SNP. There has been lots of people contacting me, particularly over the last month. People of no political party and from different political parties wanting to help, offering to help. And I've been passing them on to an organiser who's been, giving them leaflet runs and things to do. So it's not just the SNP, and I would hate anybody to think that it was a one-man band, because it certainly isn't. And we've got the great guys like Dennis that are doing a terrific job in all around the country. And so I'm not going to take long, but I just thought I'd tell you about my shopping trip today when I went to pick up Dennis. And I was in this shop in Inverness, and there was two men standing at a counter, and one of them said, there isn't enough can't do this in our country, we haven't got enough money. And one man, the other man turned around and he said, there's plenty of money as long as it's spent on the right things. He says we have to stop spending money on things that we don't want, that our country don't need, and that our people are against. You know, why are we paying for Trident, the legal wars? Why are the poor people in our society paying for the banker's mistakes under the reforms that Gordon Brown brought in? And why has this reform of the House of Lords never happened? Over 800 peers in the House of Lords sitting there, trying to alter this whole referendum debate and outcome that we're having. Why are they still being paid? We were promised that there would be reform in the House of Lords, there would be no unelected bodies, and there is. And it's got a lot more power than we recognise from where we sit or we up here. They've got a lot of power. So I guess the message I would really like to put out is it's not how much money you have, it's what you do with it. And we have got plenty of resources and money in Scotland to do much better for our people. I've one other little notice that was given to me, and I'll just mention it just now in case I forget at the end of the evening. And if there's any business people here tonight, Businesses for Scotland are having an event on Inverness on the 30th of April. So that's next Wednesday, if anyone's interested in that. And the final announcement is that myself and Dennis are going for a pint at the Westerly, I think, afterwards. So there's a live band playing there. So after the debate's finished, which I think it's intended to go until about 9 o'clock, because it's even, then we will be heading up there. So thanks for your
Now I'm going to invite questions from the audience. Can you be orderly? Can you tell us who you would like to answer the question? And if you're not orderly, I can promise you tonight eternal damnation. So could you shout out your question, because I forgot about a roving mic, and we can see if we can get our panel to actually answer them. And panellists, I'd like you to be frank, direct and straight and answer the question. So would anyone like to challenge our panellists tonight?
Yes, I would like to ask Dennis that once independence is achieved the 18th of September, Fergus said that the reason he was in the SNP was because he wanted to get independence. Once independence is achieved, the SNP then has no reason to exist. The question for Dennis is, what would he see the setup of the parties in the new Scottish Parliament, and who does he think would be Prime Minister?
I think there would be a radical realignment of Scottish politics, and I think that all the political parties in Scotland would have to have a good look at themselves in the light of a yes result in the referendum. I don't accept that the SNP, and I do not expect that the SNP will just suddenly cease to exist after the yes result in the referendum, and I don't see any reason why they should. I think that they have been part of the democratic tradition in Scotland for many decades now. They have shown that they are a party capable of government, and I think that is why they got that magnificent result which they achieved at the last election to the Scottish Parliament, the only party which has ever achieved an overall majority of seats in the Scottish Parliament, a result which was thought previously to be almost impossible under the system of proportional representation. Now, I don't agree with everything that the SNP says or does, and I look around other political parties, and sometimes I wish that my old party, the Labour Party, would get its act together. And I have said this in public at Labour meetings, and I don't mind repeating it here. It's presumably a mix next audience here, that I foresee a renaissance of the Scottish Labour Party in an independent Scotland. I certainly don't see the death of the Scottish Labour Party. I see a renaissance if that party is a truly independent Scottish Labour Party, because part of the problem at present is they're always looking over their shoulder to see what the bosses down in London are saying. Whereas if they were an independent Scottish Labour Party, they'd be liberated from that straitjacket, they'd be able to determine their own agenda, and they'd be able to respond far more readily and far more positively to the wishes, the needs and the aspirations of the people of Scotland. So I see exciting times ahead. I think that there is a place for a radical left of centre party in an independent Scotland. Fergus may argue that the SNP is radical and left of centre, and I would have to admit there are certain issues there to the left of the Labour Party, but ultimately it will be up to the people of Scotland to decide who that government will be and which party or parties will form that government. And that's what democracy is all about, whether we're left of centre, right of centre, middle of the road or whatever. It's a basic democratic principle that the people of Scotland should be allowed to choose their own government.
But I was asked earlier today, how can an independent Scotland afford investment and to grow our renewable energy sector without subsidies from England? I wondered if Fergus could help me with that a bit, please.
Yes, sir.
I can't reach it over first, I'm sorry. My apologies.
Well, we can afford to provide the incentives, and the incentives aren't a one-way street. It is absolutely correct that there is more renewable schemes in Scotland, and that's because we've got a lot of seriously bad weather, wind, and obviously strong tides and waves, and wave and tidal energy is going to happen in Scotland. We are leading the world. There will be a demonstration tidal arrays in a few years' time, and there will be, in my opinion, a commercial array of the Pentland Firth and of the island of Islay around about the early 2020s, and we will be leading the world. But the question, I think, is cost. At the moment, we have slightly more share of the total subsidy for renewables, but the total subsidy for renewables is only £30 on the average household electricity bill, which is considerably more than that, as we all know. Contrary to what you may read in what is loosely called newspapers. And secondly, there are not just incentives to renewables, because recently the UK government has decided to grant a subsidy of £45,000 million for nuclear power stations at Hinkley Point down south, a decision which has been described by one expert as one of the worst decisions in the history of government. The most expensive nuclear power station in the world, £5 million per megawatt. It costs £700,000 to build a new gas power station. So if that goes ahead, then that subsidy we would be paying our share of that £45,000 million. Now, the total subsidies for renewables under what's called the levy control framework to work up until the end of the first phase, which is 2019. It's a bit technical this, but to compare the nuclear subsidy with the renewable subsidy, the nuclear subsidy is all down south. The renewable subsidy in total is £7.6 billion. So you can see that the subsidies for nuclear actually are far, far greater than the subsidies for renewables. And I would suggest to you that as we look forward to a time when oil and gas will be around with us for a long time, but perhaps not forever, and certainly not used for the same purposes, used for better purposes, I think, then our grandchildren perhaps will not be happy if we didn't do what we were doing, which is be a world leader in renewables, to develop new forms of renewable energy, as we are doing, and we are taking the lead with, as I say, 11,700 people getting their jobs. Not just onshore wind, but hydro, biomass, grid upgrade, solar, and of course wave and tidal. And I also want to see the islands connected, and that's a particular passion of mine, to get the islands connected, because at the moment they are separated from the grid. We are often called separatists in the SNP, but it's a political claim. But in a very practical sense, islanders are separated because they can't be part of it. And yet, in the islands, you have the most effective wind turbine on this planet, operating at a huge level of effectiveness. Not surprising, because it's in Shetland. They say yes, yes there, because the first yes gets lost in the wind. So yes, it's a complex argument, but when you look at the whole, both sides of the equation on the cost, and you look at the whole energy system as you must, not just pick out one isolated element of it, then as far as cost goes, we more than pay our way. And there's another argument, which is that down south they're running out of electricity, and there's a real danger, according to the regulator, that there's serious problems afoot next year in 2017, because the peak aggregate capacity to generate electricity is only 2% to 5% greater than the peak demand. And that prediction was made in June 13, and since then 3 gigawatts of coal generation have come off the grid, so it's even worse than that. Scotland, on the other hand, we have a surplus of 20% generating capacity. 47% of our total electricity came from renewable sources last year, 47%. We have a surplus of electricity that we are exporting most of the time down south, and that will continue to be needed. So down south, Scottish electricity is at the moment helping to keep the lights on, and we want that to continue. Because whilst I thought that sometimes the English government are metaphorically in the dark, we don't want English people to be actually in the dark. So that's how it will work post-independence.
Fergus, sorry, I've just been helped up that week again. I'm trying to find that for you. See that you mentioned the North Sea oil and all that. For 30 odd years I've been in and out that game. When we first started, we were at 98% oil out in the breast, for instance. 98% oil, 2% water. Now it's the exact opposite. It's 2% water, 2% oil and 98% water. What worries me, and I hope you've got a good answer for this, is the decommissioning is going to be hell expensive. Most of the rigs I'm retired now, but most of them lately, they're all rotten, where they take megabucks to, and I just feel, it's great in my lifetime we're going to maybe get independence, but it's also a worry that in that we're going to have to try and clean up the mess after everybody's made the big bucks.
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because it's another one of these points in the previous question that I think has been the subject of really quite a lot of scaremongering. I mean, I can run through some of the statistics, and these are oil and gas UK statistics, so they're trade body statistics, they're not subject to political argy-bargy. There are 24,000 million estimated barrels of oil reserves left. There have been 39 billion extracted. So we've got more than a third left. But of course, for much of the time when that 39 billion barrels has been extracted, the barrel price was very low during the 80s. So what's left is actually of far greater value, if it can be extracted, than what's gone. And the estimated value, again according to industry, is 1.5 trillion pounds, 1.5 million pounds. The tax taken so far by the UK government is 300 billion. The cost of decommissioning estimated, and these are ballpark figures, 40 billion. So yes, you're right, it's an enormous amount of money. However, the decommissioning will be done over a long period. And the best estimate of Decom North Sea is that the anticipated cost will be $1 billion a year. Now, Scotland, of course, has had no benefit really from any oil fund, nor has the UK. The UK has had 300 billion in respect of tax revenue, and that revenue has come from the installations which are in the North Sea. And therefore we believe that because that has been the case, they should be responsible for the element of the costs of decommissioning attributable to that period of usage before independence. And that would be a matter of negotiation. But the estimated cost per annum would be of the order of £1 billion. I attended this week with Michael Fallon, the UK Minister, the launch of some statistics by Ernst & Young, the Chartered Accountants, who said that the total annual value to the UK, the turnover, the earnings of the oil and gas industry are £35,000 million, half of which is Scottish, £17 billion. So you're talking about total value from the business of an enormous quantity of money, far greater than the cost of decommissioning. And the other thing I would say in response is that I'm working very closely with a number of ports and harbours in Scotland, such as Lerwick, such as Peterhead, and possibly some in the Cromarty Firth and elsewhere, where decommissioning work could be undertaken. In other words, are we actually going to see the decommissioning done and all the work go to Korea or Norway? We need to get that work for Scotland, and that in itself will sustain jobs. And I would estimate that it's likely that Peterson SBS and Lerwick Port Authority, both of whom I've worked very closely with in this, may be one of the first movers to establish a decommissioning industry in Scotland. People like Murdo McKeever of Peterson SBS, you may know him. Ian will know him because he's from the Western Isles originally. For some reason he went off to Sheffield. But in any event, we need to build up a decommissioning industry as well, rather than see that work go. The Norwegians are doing it, but the UK hasn't got a strategy. And only recently has it started to take an interest in these things. So, yes, there are costs, but they're entirely manageable. We will accept our responsibility for that. We've made that absolutely clear, but they amount to a relatively small amount of the gross earnings and revenue from the industry and the taxation revenue from the industry. And the real value, as I said earlier, is the human capital. Did you know of that 17 billion that we make from oil and gas, nearly half is not from the North Sea at all. It is made from people, many of them who live in Nairn, Inverness, mostly from Aberdeen, I guess, who are now working all over the world in extracting oil and gas in every country. If you went to Perth, Australia, if you went to Macaé in Brazil, if you went to Houston, and you went to any oil meeting of any serious discussion, within 60 seconds, whether you want to or not, you would hear an Aberdonian accent. Because we are the best at it in the world. And increasingly, the ability to harness new technologies, not just decommissioning, but high pressure, high temperature, EOR, seismic analysis, these techniques which we are at the forefront of, especially in the subsea field, allow us then to apply that expertise and do it all over the world. And there's tens of thousands of people in Scotland who are quite simply the best in the world. And you just never really read that, do you, in the Daily Telegraph?
Like you mentioned, Norway, but Start Oil has its own.
Well, Norway decided that they would get the assets and use it for the benefit of Norway. That's what they decided. That's why they've got an oil fund of 500 billion and we've got an oil fund like Iraq of 0. And one of the things they do is decided that they would set up a state company, but another company actually, to make sure there was competition. And of course, it's more difficult when you're halfway through, if you like, the process of extraction. But it's not impossible that there could be state involvement of some sort, especially in relation to new fields, because you see, we will control the licensing, and that is the key. Control the licensing of the right to extract oil is where in the UK it's all gone sadly wrong. So we have an opportunity to have a debate about how we steward the next 40 years of oil and gas. And it will be at least 40 years. You know, you've got the Clare-Rich field, you've got Statoil actually doing the Mariner field, you've got Enquest doing the Kraken field, you've got a whole range of other companies that have plans incidentally of £100,000 million. Now, either we take charge of the regulation and taxation of that, or we allow Westminster to do what they've done for the last 40 years, which is to see the money extracted, and for us as a country not to do this right thing and set aside a fund for future generations. And your idea is, I think, one idea which a lot of people have put to me, and therefore, although there are difficulties about this, and I should make it clear, we're not in the business of expropriation. That's not really compatible with how an independent state operates. We accept all property rights and responsibilities. That underpins the whole basis of independence, whether it's people's pensions, welfare benefits, and so on and so forth. We're not in the business of confiscation. But let's be canny about this. That's what we were famous for, and let's apply that to perhaps looking at your idea further.
Fergus, is it true there's oil in the filter for play?
Well, a lot of people have written to me about that, and there's a lot of internet traffic, and I'm not on the blogosphere or the Twittersphere, whatever it is. I'm not really au fait with that, but there seems to be a lot of discussion about this, and it does seem to be the case that a lot of people are arguing this, and I don't know whether it's right or wrong, frankly, that I might get another comment from the back here, from Ian, so maybe let him answer this, but there does seem to be serious grounds to suggest that there could well be oil in other parts around our coast which have not yet been extracted. And it's the same in Ireland. They have now made discoveries. So it seems improbable that there will not be new discoveries in decades to come.
Thank you.
Okay, can I just make one comment, please? That you're all being very kind. I know you're in church, but can we have a few more provocative questions? Test them. That's the important thing to learn. So, Mr. Finlayson, I'll work my way back.
That's Mr. Finlayson the younger.
Mr. Finlayson Jr.
Dennis, you spoke about one of the main things the Yes campaign has is the food soldiers, and how the Yes campaign has that, and the Better Together campaign perhaps doesn't. I personally think the Yes campaign will win because they're running a more positive campaign. But whatever way the referendum goes, there's going to be an awful lot of annoyed people who don't agree with who's won. I think the country, to a large extent, will be split, because it will be a close vote. In the event of a yes vote in the referendum, what would you and the other panels do to reunite and re-engage the people that are not on your side?
I think that's an excellent question. I mean, I say it was a point that was touched upon by Margot's widower, Jim Sillars, during his address this morning at Margot's memorial service. And it was a message that Margot, when she knew that she was dying, wanted to pass on to Jim and virtually asked him to deliver this message that whatever the result in the referendum, and Margot obviously was campaigning and hoping and expecting a yes result, but it's so important to unite the people. We don't want what happened in Ireland in the 1920s, a terrible civil war, but I don't think that will happen because the people of Scotland have chosen the path of democracy rather than the bomb or the bullet as has been used in many other situations throughout the world by movements who are literally fighting for their independence. And I think that so far the debate, with some exceptions, there's going to be a bit hyperbolic language from Lord George Robertson about the forces of darkness and cataclysmic events, etc., etc. But by and large, I think the debate has been conducted conducted reasonably well. And I hope that that will continue after the result. And like Margot, I'm obviously hoping and expecting a yes result. But whatever the result, I think it's very, very important that the people of Scotland come together and try and Fergus touched on this too earlier, the importance of cross-party cooperation. There's no single political party has an absolute monopoly of wisdom on everything. They all have their faults and feelings as well as their positive attributes. And so it's very, very important that we reach out together in the immediate aftermath of that referendum. And I'm pleased to hear that the present Scottish Government has already publicly said that the door will be open even for those who voted no to come in and try and participate in the negotiations leading to the independent Scotland. That is very, very important, an all-inclusive approach to build a new Scotland.
Sorry, right, the gentleman in the blue sweatshirt.
Just like to ask Fergus, post the referendum, but indeed as yes vote, and there's going to be the end of the end of the nuclear term. How is Scotland going to protect its national interest?
So I didn't catch the penultimate bit of your question.
Basically, with the demise of the nuclear term and the end of Class A, how is the Scottish Armed Forces, what shape will they take?
Okay. Well, again, it's an excellent, very important question, one that affects an awful lot of people. I mean, we have made our position as a party very, very clear. I think it has support beyond the SNP, but of course, the matter or the decision in these matters will not be taken by the SNP. It will be taken by the government that is elected by the people of Scotland in 2016. So I should make that point. You know, the SNP may or may not be government. We will continue because, you know, the second part of our membership card after independence is we support the furtherance of Scotland's interests. So that's our kind of day job. We'll carry on doing that. I think it's sensible that we do that from a practical basis. But to answer your question directly, we do not think that Scotland should or needs or should possess nuclear weapons. We do not think that they are necessary nor that they have played a part in defence. They have not been used in Iraq, Afghanistan and the Falklands, nor should they have been used. They haven't played any practical part in those conflicts whatsoever. We believe in a conventional defence force, and we have plans for a conventional defence force, including armed services and navy. And of course, primary responsibility and the important priority will be to police and protect our oil installations and our offshore wind turbines, as I consented to Beatrice and Morwell fields, which will be the third largest offshore wind farm in the world. So we need to protect these interests. But of course, almost every country in the world doesn't have nuclear weapons. It's rare for countries to possess nuclear weapons. I think it's almost without precedent that small to medium-sized countries such as Scotland would possess nuclear weapons. We have had a debate in the SNP, which was controversial, that we support as a party continuance in NATO and playing our part in NATO. That was a controversial decision that some members did not agree with, but the decision was taken, and that therefore is the approach that we have taken. I personally support that, and I think we should take that approach. Of course, we need to ensure that there is continuous and effective defence, and that is the first duty of any country, to make sure it can defend itself. But as part of NATO, as essentially a peaceable country, I believe that we are perfectly capable of doing that. And we actually contribute a very substantial amount more towards defence at the moment than we receive back in terms of defence expenditure, which is very largely concentrated elsewhere in the UK. So there would be the ability, without difficulty, to afford to have a modest, scalable defence force in Scotland. And finally, I mean, we have had some of the finest and bravest soldiers in the world, and I meet many of them still. and that hasn't changed in my opinion.
Thanks, Stephen. Hopefully to make it a little bit more audible. It's a question really for Fergus. I'm not sure if I'm responding to Stephen's invitation to not be so kind. I want to try and be kind. But the question relates to a topic that Fergus raised, the pound and currency. And it's quite hard to put across the difficulty I have with that area and that issue. I thought it was very eloquent with that. He was a journalist rather than a politician who, in trying to explain and address the nationalist view of the pound and retention of the pound, he describes it a bit like this, that it's a couple going through divorce, and one of the partners is saying, I want a divorce, I want to be on my own, but I want to keep the joint bank account. And the point about that is, I'm finding it very hard to reconcile the understandable aspiration to make their own decisions, to have control of our own affairs, to assert our independence as a Scottish nation. I understand all of that. What I find difficult is how do you reconcile that with retention of the joint bank account, where the other partner from whom you are separating continues to have signature rights, decision-making rights, withdrawal rights, depositing rights, and therefore a degree of control over your, as it were, financial decision that seems to me barely compatible with real independence.
Well, again, I mean, it's a very good question. It's one that a lot of people put, so it's good that we have a chance at least to have an airing of this. And I'd make a number of points. We all have, or most of us will have a bank account. That doesn't really matter. It's how you conduct it that counts, isn't it? It's how much you spend and how much income and expenditure and how you control it that counts. When I made my pitch earlier, I said it's the power of tax and spend that is at the root of being able to deliver a fairer society and a more prosperous society. And I believe those are the fundamental benefits. Many countries that are independent have a currency union, most notably those in the EU. Is anyone really saying that Holland, Finland, the Czech Republic, Estonia aren't independent? Of course they are. There is a certain element of pooling, of sharing, of sovereignty. If, of course, those countries decide they want to do otherwise, as independent countries, they have the right to change their minds. I'm conscious that the Green Party, and Donny's here tonight, and the Green Party take a different view. So again, these are matters actually for the first Scottish Government. But let's assume for the moment that as the pound continues and there is a currency zone, and I am extremely confident that after the politicking is over, that is the only sensible conclusion. And to be clear about it, our policy has been based on the advice of a group of esteemed economists, including economists who won Nobel Prizes, that having studied all the options, this is their conclusion, that this is the best option. There are other options, but this is the best option, and that our advocacy of it should be for 10 years. And we've stated that to have clarity. What powers do we forfeit by having a currency union? Not powers over taxation, because if you look at the EU currency union, there are a whole range of different rates of taxation. Incidentally, we have just about the highest rates of taxation on just about everything that's important in this part of the country, whether it be oil from the fields, petrol in our cars, or whiskey that somebody may be consuming in the pub later with Dennis. I'll be reading a story to my 5-year-old at the time. And many of these other countries manage to charge taxation when they fill up their car of 10 or 20p less tax per litre than we do here. That's an illustration that although they have a currency union, they have the powers of independence. And none of these countries would thank you for saying that they're not independent. And of course, the last point I make is that for about a decade now, the power to set interest rates, which is really the most critical macroeconomic power there is, hasn't actually been taken by the UK politicians. It's been taken by expert advisors to the Bank of England. So that's not a power that's exercised in the political realm anymore, and that will continue. So yes, I think there is an element of pooling of sovereignty. Yes, you can challenge it and make comparisons, but I personally don't think that it's a serious objection which should cause anyone to vote no, because it's in alignment with the idea of independence that is accepted by most modern economies now in the world, who are already cooperating, sharing sovereignty as a conscious act because it is in their interests to have the benefits of a common market with no trade barriers, no border posts incidentally in any of these countries, and the ability to set your own chart your own course on far as taxation and expenditure is concerned. And as Liz quite rightly said, the power to control how we spend our money, to stop spending money on things like nuclear weapons, start spending money on looking after some of our people that need the most help. Who amongst us would think that that would not be a decision that Scotland should be able to exercise in her own right?
One more question, I'm afraid, because it's just coming up to 9. The gentleman with the beard, sir, I beg your pardon, I'm sorry for those who can't.
Just quickly on the subject of currency, if the Treasury negotiating time are so intransigent that they refuse a currency union, couldn't we seek a currency union with the Isle of Man, Gibraltar and the Channel Islands?
That's not an option I would necessarily advocate.
Can I just add briefly? I mean, if the worst comes to the worst and our UK government, or whatever you want to call them, really dig the heels in, I don't think they will, frankly, but if they really were to cover their nose to spite their face and say, no, you're not having this currency, there are other options available. That's all I'm saying at this stage. And if you want to read the other options available, read the expert commission's report in the white paper. They give at least 4 options, all of which are workable. The present Scottish Government has stated its preferred option. I've said publicly that at an earlier stage in the debate what my preferred option would be. But all I would say now is that the Scottish Government has come out with its preferred option. It's a workable option. They are the government which won the mandate from the people of Scotland for this referendum, and I think that they therefore have the right, whatever I may as an individual think, I think they have the right to pursue their preferred option. And if I could just say briefly about the analogy regarding the divorce and the joint bank account and all that, I don't think it's a very fair analogy. Now, a lot of people who've gone through the pain of divorce might think it's not very fair either, because a lot of difficult decisions have got to be taken in the event of divorce. But a divorce, in a sense, is a complete sundering of a partnership, right? We don't want a complete disruption of the partnership between Scotland and the rest of the UK. We want it to be a renewed partnership, a partnership of equals rather than what it is at present, a partnership of unequals. Inequality because of the difference in sizes of the population, inequality because of the difference in the numbers of our parliamentary representatives in the Westminster setup, and it's only if we get an equal partnership that will A, get the government of our choice, and B, take a democratic decision whether we want to do or share any of that sovereignty with other nations on things like currency or whatever. So it's not a complete disruption of a partnership which I foresee. It's a renewal that will become an equal partnership.
I'd like to thank the panel very much for coming and making yourself accountable to the people of Nairn who attended tonight. It's truly appreciated. In 5 weeks we'll have better together here and you can come and interrogate them and listen to their side. But I want the three of you to know that in this church every Sunday we pray for both sides, that in fact Scotland makes a choice which is just and fair for all its people, and I think we know that's what you want too. So thank you very much for coming. I want to say your offering will now be received.